You are listening to the Objects of Affection collection. Study 151. The Destruction Ban. Luxury can no longer burn unsold goods. The bonfire was the business model in 2018. Burberry disclosed that it had destroyed unsold products worth £28.6 million in a single year, and roughly £105 million worth across 5. The same year, reporting revealed that Richemont, owner of Cartier, had bought back and destroyed nearly €500 million of its own watches over 2 years to keep them off the grey market. In 2021, a viral video showed Coach handbags slashed by the retailer's own hand before disposal. And in July 2026, court proceedings in Hong Kong disclosed that Chanel's inventory practice in 2017 had routinely destroyed 10 to 20,000 outdated products every 6 months, a figure the house says no longer reflects its operations, which now route unsold goods through its recycling venture L'Atelier des Matières. The instinct is to read these as scandals, lapses exposed, apologized for, corrected. This study reads them differently. Destruction was not a lapse. It was the logical terminus of the industrial luxury system, the point where 3 of its structural commitments converged. Overproduction guaranteed surplus. Price integrity forbade discounting the surplus. Brand control forbade releasing it. Given those 3 axioms, the incinerator was not an accident of the system. It was the system's only remaining exit, and every large house maintained some version of it, publicly or quietly. The bonfire was not a failure of luxury logic. It was luxury logic completed. On 19 July 2026, the European Union closed the exit. The Ecodesign for Sustainable Products Regulation, EU 2024/1781, in force since 18 July 2024, activated its ban on the destruction of unsold apparel, clothing accessories and footwear for large companies operating in the single market. The unsold object, luxury's embarrassing surplus, now has legal standing the industry never granted it. It may not be deliberately killed. Roman 2. What the unsold goods destruction ban actually prohibits. The regulation's definitions are stricter than the industry's early commentary absorbed. Destruction under the ESPA means the deliberate damaging or discarding of unsold products as waste, and the definition reaches further than the furnace. Disposal counts, energy recovery counts, and decisively, recycling counts. A house that shreds its surplus and feeds the fibre into new felt has still, in the regulation's eyes, destroyed it. The hierarchy the law enforces is not landfill versus recycling. It is destruction versus continued existence. Donation, remanufacture, refurbishment and reuse are the compliant paths. This detail retroactively reframes the sector's favourite alibi. Richemont's watches were dismantled and recycled. Under the ESPA, that is not the defence, that is the offence. The ban applies to large companies now, with medium-sized enterprises following on 19 July 2030 and small and micro businesses exempt. Exceptions exist and are narrow. Genuine health and safety risks, chemical non-compliance, counterfeit goods, products damaged beyond reasonable repair or refused by donation schemes, and cases where protected logos cannot be removed. Each exception must be evidenced, and the supporting documentation retained for 5 years. The burden of proof sits with the destroyer. Around the prohibition, the regulation builds a ledger. Since 2025, large companies have been obliged to disclose publicly how many unsold products they discard each year, by product code, with the reasons, and with the shares routed to reuse, recycling, recovery and disposal, updated annually on their own websites or in their sustainability reports. A standardized reporting format becomes mandatory for financial years starting on or after 2 March 2027. Enforcement belongs to national authorities, with penalties that member states must make effective, proportionate and dissuasive, referenced in the regulation at up to 4% of annual union turnover for serious infringement. France arrived here first. Its anti-waste law banned destroying unsold textiles from 1 January 2022, after estimates that €650 to €730 million of unsold goods were destroyed in France each year. The EU has now generalised the French position to a market of 450 million consumers. Roman 3. Why luxury burned? The scarcity ledger to understand what the ban interrupts. One must be precise about why a rational business destroys its own inventory. The practice was not waste in the colloquial sense, it was accounting. The industrial luxury system prices its objects far above their material cost, and that spread is held open by a single guarantee. The object will never be available for less. Discounting is therefore not a margin decision but an existential one. A Cartier watch sold at 40% off does not merely earn less, it testifies that the price was always negotiable, and the testimony contaminates every unit sold at full price. The grey market makes the same testimony without permission. Against these threats, destruction functioned as the enforcement arm of scarcity, the house repurchasing its own surplus and deleting it, spending real money to keep the sign undiluted. In this institution's lexicon, destruction was the purest expenditure ever made in defense of sign value that lives in the signal and dies on contact with the discount rack. Note what this implies about the objects themselves. A system that would rather incinerate its product than let it reach a second market has priced the object's meaning entirely in its scarcity, and not at all in its substance. The destroyed watch and the destroyed trench were in the moment of destruction, revealed as what the framework calls hollowed objects. Artifacts whose material excellence was real but subordinate, valuable only while the sign stayed scarce, disposable the instant the sign was at risk. The industry's own hands made the argument its critics could not have made as vividly. Nothing says the object was never the point, like burning it to protect the logo. The scale was industrial because the surplus was structural. EU Analyze's estimate that unsold stock runs to roughly a fifth of textile inventory, that 4 to 9% of unsold textiles were destroyed before ever being worn, between 264,000 and 594,000 tons a year, generating around 5.6 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions annually. Overproduction at that scale is not a forecasting error repeated by coincidence across an industry. It is the mold economics this institution has documented elsewhere, minimum volumes set by production infrastructure, not by demand, with the gap between them managed downstream by discounting in the mass market and by destruction in luxury. The warranty of obsolescence was never only about objects failing in use. It was also this: objects scheduled to die unworn, because the system that made them required their death to protect the price of their siblings. Roman 4. The ledger and the furnace, what changes now? The ban's mechanical effect is to delete the terminal option. Surplus must now survive, donated, remanufactured, refurbished, resold, but the disclosure obligation is the deeper instrument because it converts a private practice into a public number. From 2025, every large house must publish how much it discards and why. The quantity of unsold production, the figure the industry has guarded more closely than any margin, becomes an annual, auditable admission. Analysts will read it as a demand forecasting scorecard. Journalists will read it as a hypocrisy index. This institution will read it as the first official census of the hollowed object, a yearly count of how many artifacts the system made that nobody ever needed. Compliance in the shallow sense is already underway. Resale partnerships, outlet channels reframed as circularity, donation programs, remanufacture ateliers. Some of this is genuine. The same week the ban took effect, the EU's digital product passport registry went live, the infrastructure that will eventually let any buyer read an object's material biography, and houses that invested early in traceability will find both regimes cheap to satisfy. But the deep compliance is not logistical. A house can only stop destroying surplus sustainably by ceasing to produce it, and surplus is not an operational accident that better software will remove. It is the signature of speculative volume, of producing for projected demand rather than for actual bodies. The post-luxury read, production discipline is the only compliance. This institution's framework has long held that the alternative to the burn pile is not the recycling contract. It is the production model that never generates the pile. The made-to-order object, the one original principle, the practice that manufactures on demand for a specific customer, does not have an unsold goods problem, and therefore does not have a destruction problem, a disclosure embarrassment, or an ESPA compliance program. Our study of Chanel's decision to stop shredding unsold goods read that reform as circularity adopted in defense of brand sovereignty. The regulation now makes the same reform mandatory for the whole large company sector, which means the differentiator migrates upstream, from how a house treats its surplus to whether it produces surplus at all. The practitioners this institution documents as post-luxury already live on the far side of that migration. The maker who prints one pair of shoes when one buyer's scan arrives holds no inventory to destroy. The atelier whose production is commissioned rather than projected has no July 19 exposure. What the regulation punishes is precisely the distance between production and body that the industrial system institutionalized. What it rewards, structurally if not intentionally, is the made-for-one architecture the framework has argued for from the start. The state did not adopt the post-luxury position out of conviction. It arrived there by subtraction, banning the practices the old system needed. The conclusion is the same either way. After September's greenwashing ban polices what luxury may say, and July's destruction ban polices what luxury may discard. The only fully compliant mason is the one that makes what is already spoken for. Coda, the value that could not be burned. There is a final irony in the regulation's timing that deserves the record. The industry spent a century insisting its objects were heirlooms, made to outlast their buyers, carriers of permanent value. It simultaneously operated furnaces for the ones that did not sell. The law has now sided, awkwardly and bureaucratically, with the industry's advertised self-image against its actual practice. The object must be treated as if its existence mattered, as if it were, in the framework's language, an artifact with a claim to narrative permanence rather than a unit of scarcity accounting. That is the quiet radicalism of 19 July 2026. The regulation does not require luxury to be virtuous. It requires luxury to behave as though its own mythology were true. Houses whose objects genuinely are what the marketing says, durable, specific, wanted before they are made, will find the new regime describes their existing life. Houses whose volume was always speculative will spend the coming years learning in public annually by product code exactly how much of what they made the world never asked for. The bonfire is over. The ledger is lit instead. This has been a study from the Objects of Affection collection, a critical art research institution operating under the framework of post-luxury conceptual functional art. Read the full research at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.